Hello, everyone, and welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series for Parents. I'm your host, Laura Stack, the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors, where we educate parents and teens about the dangers of today's high-potency THC products, especially on adolescent brain development, mental illness, and suicide. Johnny's Ambassadors was formed 6 months after the death of our son, Johnny, who died from suicide from using high potency concentrates and getting psychosis. So today we have another expert whom I will introduce in just a moment. After we go over a couple quick logistics, this session is being recorded. Please share it with your friends and family. Dr. Voth has provided several handouts for you today. There are 5 in the control panel or on this page where you're watching the recording. He has also provided a notes page with his slides and some lines if you wish to take notes and follow along as we go. He will present for 45 minutes here or so and then take the remaining time in questions. So please type those into the question box as you think of them, and I will read them off to Dr. Voth in the end in the order they were received. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Eric Voth, who is a specialist in internal medicine, pain management, and addiction medicine in Topeka, Kansas. He is a pioneer in the appropriate prescribing of controlled medications, and he is recognized as an international authority on drug use, drug policy-related issues, pain management, and appropriate prescribing practices. He serves as the president and chairman of the board of the International Academy on the Science and Impact of Cannabis, or IASIC. Dr. Voth is a former member of the National Advisory Committee for the Center of Substance Abuse Treatment of HHS, and he is a clinical professor of internal medicine at the University of Kansas School of Medicine. He has advised Reagan, Clinton, both Bushes, and Obama administrations, and he has advised or testified for numerous congressional offices on drug-related issues. Eric, thank you so much for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
It's great to be with you. One of the things we're going to do today, which may be a little different than what some people have gone through before, is to try to focus on the background of the legalization movement, which really kind of started with this whole medical marijuana farce. And that has been used as a stalking horse to gain public support and actually legislative support, et cetera. So what I'm going to come at is a little different than some presentations. And I need to, there we go, advance my slide there. So remember now that when we're talking about medication, virtually all medications have side effects. And it's important that we understand those side effects, and we have to have legal ways and social ways of dealing with them. And that's true for medicinal applications of marijuana also. The other piece that seems to get lost, particularly by legislators and marijuana advocates, is that all medicines must be approved by the FDA. And the FDA is a bit at fault here too, because they have not really held fast and said, well, wait a minute, states, you can't do this. Medicines need to come through the FDA. So remember, the FDA has not approved marijuana for medicinal uses. There are other parts of marijuana that have been approved. And remember, marijuana for the most part is smoked or vaped or dabbed. It's impure, unpredictable dosing. We're going to talk about a number of the side effects. And when you look back at this, let's say as a physician looking at a medicine, if you took the name marijuana out of it, you'd look at these side effects, the dose instability, and you'd say, I would never want to see this substance approved as a medicine, but maybe there are some things in marijuana that might be useful, which is exactly what they've done. So there has been approval of Marinol for years, and it's actually a class 3 drug now and can be prescribed appropriately. There are other things on the market. There's Epidiolex, which is CBD, and that's another whole discussion in and of itself. And then there are things like Sativex that's actually inhaled, but it's like inhaling oils. I used this slide years ago, actually in the early 1990s, and it used to always get a big laugh because people would look at this and say, well, how ridiculous is that? My pharmacy is not going to sell bongs, for heaven's sakes, or Cheech and Chong lamps. Well, folks, particularly in the states that have legalized marijuana for medicinal uses, this is what you are facing, but it doesn't have controls. And a big part of the reason that you're facing that is the pressure, the marketing, the salesmanship that has gone on, like Michael Phelps here, a big smoker of pot. Also, I would notice Mike Phelps has had all sorts of psychiatric difficulties that he's dealt with, and I'd be very curious to have a face-to-face discussion with him about all that sometime. So marijuana. I would suspect that just about anybody that tunes into this is going to know that, yes, it's a very impure substance. It has over 80 cannabinoids. It highly resembles tobacco, and that's something that's been lost in a lot of the discussion. If you took the constituents of tobacco and the constituents of marijuana side by side, except for the cannabinoids, they're almost equal. There are now high THC concentrations, and even though I list that up to 30%, that's not taking into account the hash oils, the hashish, the vaped types, or dabs, or concentrates that go all the way up to 90% that have been identified. The thing about THC that makes it also strange to work with and a little tricky as a medicine is its half-life is 5 to 7 days. So if you smoke a strong joint, that can hang around for days. And I've personally experienced that with psychotic patients that have traveled to Colorado and gotten into really, really significant doses of THC and actually had to be hospitalized because they were so psychotic when they came back to Kansas. If you track the THC concentrations of marijuana, this is a DEA report. Almost all federal reports lag by about 2 years. I can tell you that we're not dropping, certainly, and the red line here is the one that indicates that as of 2019, we're sitting at averages of about 14% THC. Compare that way back to the years when I was early involved with the whole issue back in the 1970s. And I would say, to declare openly, I smoked pot for a brief period of time back in the 1970s. And it was very clear that the people around me and I myself were looking at that going, I don't feel right. And there are psychotic episodes even then, and people getting addicted to marijuana and other drugs. So I stepped back and said, there's got to be something more to this. And my first testimony to a legislature was 1977 or 8, right around in there. So I've been at this well over 40 years and have watched this all unfold. So let's talk now about the proposed, and I'm going to use the term alleged, medicinal uses of marijuana. These are things that the marijuana advocates have set forth, and I'll talk more about these as we go along. One of the real early applications was for the nausea associated with chemotherapy. A very early application was the thought that it would help glaucoma, even though it was found to not be effective, and to get pressures in the eye reduced, a person would have to stay on it almost continually, which some people do. It's also been proposed for appetite stimulation, a whole host of neurologic illnesses, including multiple sclerosis, pain, menstrual cramps, sleep disorders, depression. And if you read these state legislature initiatives, most of them will have some wording that says any chronic condition. So it's a little bit like that advertisement. Where's the beef? Where's the research? The research has been done on much of this and found that nausea is questionable because of the mental side effects. Glaucoma just doesn't work. Appetite stimulation, yes, it does to some extent, but when people were weighed and measured, it was not actually lean body mass that increased, it was body fat. Multiple sclerosis, neurologic diseases, the research is very weak in those. Pain is a question mark. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that one. And certainly menstrual cramps, sleep, depression, hocus pocus. If anything, it makes depression worse. If anything, it is clearly shown to advance depressive symptoms to the point of psychotic and or actual suicidal thoughts. So one of the recent studies, and this is really actually kind of called a review of the reviews, looked at a whole host of citations on pain management and all these various other applications. And as I've seen in my work and research, they found that maybe there would be a small benefit for certain types of neuropathic pain, usually best when coupled with another pain agents. But the bottom line is essentially these kind of reviews are saying don't bet on marijuana being a great miracle medication. Who's using marijuana? Well, this is actually a little bit dated information, and I'll tell you why I go back that way. But interestingly, most of the people that have asked for it for medicinal applications are for pain. And most of the pain docs that deal with legitimate pain treatment will tell you pain is so tricky. It's not like you can take a temperature for pain or do a blood test for pain. It's a subjective phenomenon. So the patient says, oh, I'm having so much, da, 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 da. Well, with all the work I did with pain, with narcotics, opiates, all sorts of medication, that also is the most convenient excuse to get things you're not really supposed to have, like high doses of opiates, high doses of narcotics, and certainly for marijuana. Interestingly, though, some people were asking for it for depression, anxiety, and most of the pain folks were in an older age group. So let's talk about the pain applications for a little bit here. This is a little more dive into one of the systematic reviews, and really their summary of this is that of anything, maybe some forms of neuropathic pain could be benefited by THC, not necessarily marijuana. And that's a big distinction you got to remember. This study that takes us back a little bit further did a look at the differential dosing of THC. And interestingly, they found that there was better decrease of pain in the lower to medium dose ranges, and the higher dose ranges actually resulted in increases in pain. They postulated perhaps there's something there that was causing this sort of strange reaction the other direction. Another out of the journal on pain, the questions come up, what's an effective dose? Well, you know, they really looked at a lot of different types of pain. And interestingly, the first thing they said was, well, the pain reduction did not appear to be superior to anything else that was an available standard medication. And more importantly, massive doses were not necessary. If you ask around, if you're in a state that's allowed medical marijuana, or for that matter, recreational marijuana, very few states have done anything to try to control the doses available of THC. So massive doses go out, massive concentrations, and if it's being used for a quasi-legitimate application like pain, massive doses are not necessary. And this is another one that was looking at placebo versus medium versus low dosing, and found that actually the low dosing, again, of THC seemed to have a greater effect. So to just summarize around pain, the literature is tricky. It's not just talking about smoked marijuana. Many are talking about oral or synthetic cannabinoids, and for the most part, there's some potential as maybe a slight adjunct, having a slight amount of benefit with neuropathic pain. But if used as a solo agent, the effective doses are not defined. Now, I want to dig into the effects of marijuana because really we're looking at a whole spectrum here. It's not just for medical uses, but it is now, of course, as you know, being pushed for recreational uses. So we have to think with two sides of our brain. One side being medicine, what I, as a physician or another physician, would look at and say, okay, what are the benefits and what are the risks? And then the public, who thinks they may be using for a medical use, or maybe they're using for a recreational use. And the implications of side effects and effects of marijuana are significant. So as we look at this slide, it's reminding us that the brain develops in a very systematic manner. The first things that develop in children are more the coordination and sensory functions. Little Johnny learns that he can pick up a ball and throw it. And he or little Susie have learned that they like to run and they like to play in a physical manner. Then as they get a little older, roughly age 6 to 10, they develop more motivation for their wants, like, hey, I want to go play baseball. I want to throw the ball. I want to ride my bicycle. But then as you get into the early teens, so 12, 16 along in there, the amygdala kicks in, and that's the area of the brain that develops emotion. Oh, I love Johnny. Oh, I love that food. Oh, I love that marijuana that I've been given at a party to smoke. And now you got a problem, because there's coordination, motivation, a development of like, and what is lacking is that modulator in the brain that I call the governor, that doesn't develop until people are roughly 23 to 25 years old. So you have all that desire going and nothing to mitigate it and to modulate it. And that then is so important when we look at why people use, and more importantly, when they use. So several things. This actually came out of JAMA Psychiatry. It was a nice summary looking at the various mental and psychiatric impacts of marijuana. Difficulty with motivation, psychotic episodes we'll talk more about, cognitive capacity, so thinking capacity, and some actual brain structural changes. When you look at some of the overall impacts that you'll see in more chronic use, attention, concentration, decision making, reduced inhibitions and more impulsivity, which may be one of the reasons that we see some violent behaviors and aggressive behaviors. Working memory, difficult, can really impair in particularly students, verbal fluency, and concept formation and planning. Some other work that came out just a few years ago, which really is now very concerning, is actual changes in the gray matter of the brain. Certain areas in the cerebral cortex, and one looks at, well, what does this mean long term? Real structural changes in the brain taking place. So another study that then looked at that was finding changes in what's called the hippocampus and certain other areas that was really then pointing to intellectual changes and neuropsychological decline. One of the studies down around that time frame was looking at neurologic and neuropsychiatric testing at age 13. And there was broad decline across all of the domains in people that were using. And interestingly, if you look at age 13 to 38 with persistent use, a 6-point decline in IQ. And that has devastating impacts if you look at intellectual function and potential for holding difficult or demanding jobs, etc. There's been good research done on life outcomes, essentially worse high school completion, worse degree attainment, worse downrange educational benefits. And the interesting thing is, if those people used before age 17, illicit drugs, suicide attempts, etc., cannabis dependence, and psychiatric disorders were much higher. Now, this came from a guy that contacted me once, left a message, excuse me, on my phone, and I thought, this really encapsulates what this is all about. It said, I used, that's USED, used to smoke this stuff regularly. I quit because I needed to pass a test, urine test obviously, to get a job. The reason I am writing is because I never had any of those THOUGS side effects you talk about. Don't get me wrong, it's not for everybody, but you don't need to say untrue things about it. Coordination, impairment, that's BS. It allows you to focus better on single things. It's perfect for kids like Iowa's that can't concentrate on doing well. You don't have to apply to this email. I'm just bored and looking at stuff on the net and emailing people and going on and on because I can't sleep well. You have a nice day. That run-on sentence there maybe gets to the core of this more than about anything else. So in that same age group, of course, these young people are starting to drive. And if you look at the impairment of driving skills, and this now goes back 21 years, and it was looked at even before that time, that the combination of alcohol and marijuana was significant, and in the higher amounts, like the 200 microgram doses, just like drinking enough alcohol to have a 0.14 blood alcohol level. Now, of course, this is not meant for anything except humor, but my point is, how does marijuana impact driving? Well, the first thing that goes with most intoxications, and marijuana is no different, is judgment. Do you think it was good judgment to put a ton of plywood on the back of a tiny little car? Or drive down the road when it's really slick at 80 miles an hour? Or pack the car full and not be paying attention, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the things we have to look at with marijuana, is impacting judgment and et cetera. So this opens up a whole different area that seems to have just been overlooked in the last few years. California was kind of the first test ground for fatal crashes. And it was really remarkable that as of 2008, it was rivaling alcohol as a top cause of traffic fatalities. So let's talk about some of the psych and behavioral risks. By the way, I'll back up to that slide one moment. Colorado experienced the same thing, and I'll show you down the road here, if I have some time, a slide that demonstrates the accidents with first medical marijuana and then subsequently the general legalization. Now, cannabis use disorder is becoming more common, clearly recognized as a psychiatric disorder. It's now being linked to self-harm, unintentional death, intentional death, and really this is one of those things that should be held out in strong consideration before we try to back off any controls on marijuana, especially general legalization. Back in 2019, there was a big discussion in Lancet Psychiatry about the psychotic episodes that were being seen, and there seemed to be a general consensus that the severity threshold seemed to be about 10% THC. I would point out, though, that well before we got to 10%, people were having psychotic episodes with marijuana. This is an interesting study that goes back a few years, but I'll tell you why I was really concerned about it. First of all, it was talking about risk of psychosis with no prior episodes, clearly higher in people that were users than non-users. But here's the tricky part. Continued pot use put people at risk for psychosis at about 31%, but 20% who did not continue using continued to have risks of psychotic episodes out 8.5 years, even though they had not continued to use marijuana. PTSD, a big problem. Unfortunately, somebody got the notion that marijuana would be effective for PTSD, and out of some big studies looking at this, in fact, it turned out that the non-users had less symptoms, users had higher levels of violence, new users had also high levels of violence and more other drugs, and the presumption that it was going to help PTSD is just simply not true. Some other things we see with violent episodes: impulsivity, hostility episodes. Really, this is core to some of the problems that we've seen around the country. Depression we've talked about. Bipolar illness. For a while there was a big argument as to whether it had any impact on bipolar illness, but it's pretty clear that not only can it trigger full mania, but it certainly can trigger hypomania that's associated with all the other problems. Sexual assault victimization, yes, believe it or not, predictors of violence, partner aggression, partner violence, dating aggression, etc. And the reason I bring that up is we are in a serious time of violence in our country. And I am incredibly concerned when you look at so much of this violence being conducted by young males. Is marijuana playing a role there? And we don't know because they're not getting drug tested. And if you have an opportunity to influence any of the policymakers, I think that any kind of violent episodes need to be followed by drug testing to see what role drugs are playing, whether it's just pot or pot and meth, etc. So, marijuana dependence. The reality of it is people do become addicted to marijuana. Not everybody, but they do. And the higher the THC concentration, the greater the likelihood. This study by Crowley goes clear back into the 90s. Their conclusion was that it progresses at least as rapidly, if not more rapidly, than alcohol. And that fits into another thing that I'm going to briefly talk about, and that is opiate overdoses. One part of my professional life has been looking at the appropriate treatment and use of opiates and treatment for pain. And if you look at these three states, it's Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, who really, sort of opened the door early on these things. To the far left, you'll see when medical marijuana was allowed, and then on the far right, you'll see when marijuana was legalized and what the opiate overdose deaths did during that period of time. Absolutely clear. Oregon, similar kind of phenomenon. Washington, similar kind of phenomenon. Why is that? Well, I'm going to come back around to that in a little bit. Another area that really concerns me is the fetal newborn effects. We have a lot of young women that are smoking pot out there. They don't know they're pregnant, or maybe they know they're pregnant, but it has clearly been associated with birth weight, length, head circumference, abnormal development, and neurologic difficulties. This study goes way back, looking at subsequent developmental problems when there was use during the first trimester, and then how people perform down the road. And poor intelligence ratings at age 6, attention and depression at age 10. So definitely fetal effects. Interestingly, in Colorado, this data came out a couple of years ago, that you've got all these dispensaries floating around out there, and none of them are trying to get control of the possibility of pregnant women using marijuana. I mean, there's no warnings, there's no prohibition on that, and few, if any, had discussions with their healthcare providers about the potential impact on pregnancy. Now, some of the social impacts of marijuana go beyond marijuana itself. This is a great slide that goes clear back to 1975, and I won't tell you who was in high school at that point in time. But if you notice, some of the most pronounced use was back in the early 70s. And there was a very clear relationship that when there was a perception of harm, that marijuana use dropped. And that continued to the Clinton era of 1992, and there's been a steady increase since that time. The other thing that bears a little bit of discussion is that, when you argue this whole marijuana issue, it always seems to come back around to, oh, so many people are going to jail for marijuana. Oh, that's terrible. Well, we really need to understand that. And what you find when you dig into this is that there are typically people getting into sentencing situations where they plead guilty and then they get stuck with a smaller amount. The reality of it is, as far as being the risk of being arrested, it's 1 in every 12,000 joints smoked, and less than 1% of people serving time were for simple possession. And if you look at the arrests, the median amount of marijuana that those people were arrested with were 115 pounds. So then they plea bargain and say, okay, I'll take guilty, and they're allowed to plead to a much lesser charge. Well, it's great being right next door to Colorado because, you know, it's kind of like living close to a petri dish, and you can watch a lot of bad things take place, and then you go, wow, we really shouldn't be doing that. Kansas is still not allowed medical marijuana, although we're close. I hope we continue to fail. But what we've seen in Colorado is really a mess. And even though I laugh a little at this, this is kind of really cut straight to the issue. Ho, 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 dude. Santa after eating cookies that were left out for him in Colorado. So it's really clear that daily use is higher than national average. Heavy use is higher than the national average. At least 9 to 10% of the population are using. This is a little bit dated, and I did this on purpose because this reflects more the medical marijuana time frame rather than the legalization time frame. And you can see relative to the rest of the country, marijuana use is more significant. This is a little bit old now, but you know, you've probably often heard these statistics that there are more recreational dispensaries and there are Starbucks, and it's really remarkable. And clearly, where there's greater penetration, there's greater purchasing and greater use. Now, this goes back a little bit prior to legalization in Colorado. The fatal crashes relative to having a THC effect really started to bump at about 2008. And then you can see that rise. I've got another slide that picks up more from there. Here we go. And this really shows you on the right there the percentage of total fatalities. And you can really see it begin to kick up when marijuana was frankly legalized. Marijuana and crime. This is getting a little bit dated now, but personal crime, property crime. And there was another article that down in Denver, particularly central Denver, some of the felonies were up 70%. Taxation is an interesting angle because, you know, I don't know of any other medicine that is used by legislators to try to get tax income. I mean, maybe OxyContin or oxycodone, if we could put stiff taxes on those, it could pay for education, which is ludicrous. And that's one of the things, of course, we tout relative to marijuana. Wow, all this tax increase and tax income. Well, that revenue, by the way, is not all that significant compared to the overall costs of education, let's say. And you have to factor in the social costs. And opioid deaths, fentanyl deaths, cocaine, etc. I mean, those are all very real, and they have been directly related to what's gone on with marijuana legalization. And you can see that top line there are the any opioid deaths. You know, the more loose drug abuse gets, the more loose marijuana gets, the more people becoming habituated to it. Just feeds right into that whole stream of social problems. This is interesting also. This is the percentage of THC. I think I showed this earlier, but I wanted to come back to this. You know, down in the early 90s, you know, 3-4% THC was common, and now we're in Colorado at about 14%, but that does not take into account the genetically manufactured forms of THC, things like the synthetics, things like hash oil, etc. And some of those are 70-90%. It was interesting back in about 2013-14, There was a paper that came out that said marijuana legalization reduces the problem of drug overdose and drug opiate deaths. Well, it's interesting. If you look there, that 2014 cycle, there was a brief blip downward. But what they didn't say in that article was that was the same year that Colorado passed a mandatory registration for the prescription drug monitoring program. And shortly after, as people got used to that, the overdose deaths went right back up. So a few questions to hit at some point. First of all, is medical marijuana more dangerous than legal drugs? Should marijuana be a medical option? Is marijuana a gateway drug or a stepping stone drug, and does it have a whole host of psychological and social problems associated with it? I would come back and say, just my opinion, and this is based on 40 plus years of being hands-on working on this, following the research, and dealing with this on multiple levels. Yes, marijuana is dangerous. It is at least as dangerous as many of the legal drugs, because even though you have overdoses with some of the legal drugs, you don't have the psychotic episodes. Should marijuana be a medical option? I would say absolutely not. Stick with medications. Make them go through the FDA. If there is some dosing that is safe and effective, maybe that's a different story. But that should go through the FDA, and that should be an FDA decision. Is it a gateway drug or a stepping stone drug? I have two answers to this. One, yes, there is a gateway effect, but also in and of itself, marijuana alone is a dangerous drug. There's enough harm associated with just marijuana use that we should do everything we can to push back and try to rein it in and get people to be using less of it or getting rid of it altogether. And with that, I am available for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let me take our slides down here so that everybody can see you. Let me get this going here. Okay. There we are. Wow. Eric, thank you so much. And you just went through a ton of information. I'd like to try to distill some of that and also get some of your opinions. And we have several questions here. And we still have plenty of time. So if anyone has questions, please type them in for Dr. Voth, since we have him here live, and you can ask him any question you want about his presentation. First question, do you have further information about the THCP that is claiming to be developed by this Italian research community that states they are developing a cannabinoid similar to THC, but is 30 times stronger than the high potency THC available in the US? And this person sent a link to the THCP, the tetrahydrocannabidiol, which is very hard to pronounce. But it says it has a bond 33 times stronger than THC. Are you aware of the development of this particular cannabinoid?
Yes, well, I'm aware. I haven't studied it in detail. I see a lot of that stuff kind of passing through, and I would say, oh my God, caution, 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 because that cannabinoid binding to the receptor is the whole key behind a lot of its effects. And you get something that's binding that rigorously, I think we're going to see horrible problems with that. Yeah, I think if they're going to try to push it as an intoxicant, that's one thing. It may be if they try to somehow come at it as a medication, you could reduce dose levels enough to try to get some therapeutic effect. But that's something that's got to be done in the lab. That's not just take it out on the street and start selling that stuff.
Right.
So that kind of thing would have to come through an FDA process, and maybe they'll find that, like a millionth of a milligram might have some therapeutic effects. But that's a whole different story than smoking pot.
Right. And there would be very little, it's apparently not present in very large quantities, of course, but it also talks about the atoms, and that the THCP has 7 instead of 5 in the other naturally occurring cannabinoids. That's why they believe that it's very potent.
Oh,
So,
I bet it'll be potent. Oh yeah, I bet it'll be real potent.
Well, we'll stay tuned on that then. Okay, great presentation. If I recall correctly, you hail from Kansas. Yes, I believe that's true.
Yes.
Yes.
And I've gotten a lot of criticism for that because they say, well, Kansas is always behind. And on marijuana, I say, yay, Kansas, we're behind. We haven't legalized and we haven't allowed it for medical uses yet. But I will tell you, we've got some very, very sharp scientific people working on this and some good legislators. And I hope they don't bow to the marijuana industry because that's really what it's about. The marijuana industry is just pumping money in like crazy to swing the legislators, and they have these big parties for them and all that stuff. And I hear in Kansas that they have these parties and they sit around and talk about me. So, yay, that's
good.
fine.
You're making a difference. Well, and that's what the question was.
A big difference.
Asking you to talk a bit about the viewpoints there in Kansas. What is the medical community and the general public's opinions? What is their stance toward both medical and recreational use?
Well, I think it's changed a little bit over time because there is just this endless, constant barraging by the marijuana industry, and unfortunately, some of our press has become very marijuana liberal. I'll tell you, we had almost no coverage of the side discussing problems with marijuana, and our paper had 3 huge runs on, oh, it'll be so wonderful this and so wonderful that. So just 1 second, I'm going to shut that off. So, okay, and so I would say there's a lot of there is a representation of liberal thought. Okay, I think there is some group that is trying to do the right things, that very, reasonable people who could be impacted. And one of the difficulties that I've seen is just getting through to them because the press, at least here, all over Kansas, has got a lock on that information. And despite a number of us trying to get that stuff out into the public, they just sit on it and they suppress it. And that's something I haven't seen before, and it's really kind of dastardly. So this kind of an open forum that we're talking about is great, but it's limited. And I think the control of the media is substantial.
Well, in this new organization that you've put together with IASIC, I think it's so critical that you have created an alliance, a group of doctors such as yourselves who will now kind of band together and perhaps speak up against these types of things and have a legitimacy behind it instead of the disparate groups. And we've tried here at Johnny's Ambassadors to bring in experts and get them kind of all in one place and provide this kind of education to the community. What are you seeing with the IASIC group that you've put together and its plans, and how people, Kansas and other governments, how can they use your expertise to help combat some of these views?
Well, first off, you're totally right. There's been a doc or two here or there, and people really trying hard. But what we really worked to do was find the docs that knew what the heck they were talking about. People that really understood drugs and marijuana and written, had scientists, and we've got a heck of a fine group put together. And then, we put our positions together, and we on the website tried to get and are still getting as much of the medical media as we can so that people can just copy it right off and go to the legislators and say, well, here it is. So we want to be really accessible both to physicians, but also to the public, so that there's a way that people can argue, hey, don't use so-and-so drug. And it's not just marijuana, it's focused on marijuana because marijuana is kind of the underpinning, the underlay for all the drug abuse, really.
That's good to know, but that's available for other people to use as a resource.
Absolutely.
So thank you for putting that together. And we have your logo on our website. If anyone's interested, at johnnysambassadors.org, under the partners menu, we have our alliance, and we have a link to your site. So hopefully they can go and check out all the great resources you're providing there. Okay, you mentioned that the half-life of THC was 5 to 7 days. Can you clarify whether that is a functional half-life, i.e. its brain effects, or the half-life for its blood level?
Well, that's the actual metabolic half-life. So if you were drawing blood specimens, let's say once an hour, you'd find that it drops off at about 3 days-ish. You would be carrying about half the blood level. And if you think about drug users, then of course, when they're smoking every day or several times a day, they never really get a chance to hit half-life. They will metabolize, but then they load more.
Okay.
See, so what really happens if somebody's using regularly is they just get a steady state and really never clear it. That's one of the big problems also with drug testing and that kind of thing, is it'll pick up. I mean, I have personally drug tested people out 60 days and had positive screens, depending on where you set the threshold, because the body's trying to rid itself slowly. But it's not like water-soluble drugs that go away pretty quickly.
Wow, I had no idea. 60 days, that's incredible. Do you have any figures, since you mentioned you are in Kansas, on how much of the Colorado pot ends up in the hands of your youth in Kansas?
I've heard the discussion, and I've talked to our Kansas Highway Patrol folks, and there weren't good stats that I had at that point, but they said it is, quote, frequent that what they're busting here has come across the border. It's hard too, because unless they're doing genetic tracking of it, it's hard to know some of those origins too. One of the things that's crazy in Colorado, for instance, is that the illegal marijuana sales, so stuff from south of the border, has skyrocketed, or things that are being grown illegally have skyrocketed. And it's very hard to track that stuff.
Yeah.
DEA works hard at it, but I mean, that's, and they'll tell you that there is a huge surge upward of the quote illegal, non-taxed stuff from cartels.
Yeah, there was just a big bust here in Colorado. So, even though it's legal, there's still a lot of black market activity, of course, going on. Even worse.
That really should get a lot of attention is, the illegal growing of marijuana. They're using pesticides, damaging whole areas, fields in the mountainous areas, water, etc. It's a very water-consuming plant. And even in the legal grows, down in Denver, I mean, they've got huge amounts of water and electricity that they're requiring.
Electricity for the
which
light.
has a secondary, a secondary effect of how do you generate that electricity? So burn more coal so that people can get stoned. So.
You made a comment about how cannabis is the kind of underlying factor in drug abuse, and one of your colleagues, Dr. Ken Finn, discussed how drug use in Colorado since legalization has just skyrocketed in all of the drugs, all of the drug use. And in fact, here in Colorado, when 1317 was passed, my husband John and I were able to be there with our partners and many alliances there for the signing. And I have Governor Polis's pen, actually, from that signing, given to me by one of the bill's sponsors. And he mentioned in his comments before, he basically passed it off. He didn't want to sign this, of course. He's a buddy of the pot industry, and said, oh, this is supposed to protect 18 to 20-year-olds. But, we know how helpful marijuana is to get over opioid addiction. He actually publicly said that and I'm standing there trying not to, laugh out loud.
That's a huge farce. There's absolutely no evidence that marijuana helps get over and in fact enhances opiate addiction. You know, it's that whole brain chemistry, you know.
Yeah.
And the stronger the pot, the stronger the THC, the more it enhances that whole brain chemistry problem. And that's why people are out going, wow, that was fun. What does this do? Oh, it's oxycodone. Oh, let's chew some OxyContin. Oh, let's shoot up some fentanyl. Now, the other piece of that that's tricky, and I know is a fact, and I wish I could prove it, you know, beyond a doubt, but you know, a lot of the people that died from fentanyl were dying from the illegal fentanyl that was coming across the borders that was many times stronger than an IV fentanyl or something you'd get during surgery.
Right.
Well, if you've been smoking pot, who do you get that from? Maybe you grow your own, but you're going to get it from a drug dealer. And once that need for intoxication kicks in, and somebody's got something a little cooler, oh, hey, I got this new powder, you know, well, it's going to happen. And that is where the risk is. You know, people are expecting one type of high with low grade, you know, pharmaceutical fentanyl, and they get this stuff and boom, they overdose.
Yeah.
And it's hideous, and it's seriously dangerous stuff.
Well,
I know,
and you would know,
they
you
did
know,
in Colorado too, but I'm sure for a fact in Florida, the EMS folks will use up to 5 injections of Narcan when they know that somebody's been exposed to the bad fentanyl, the lab fentanyl. Just load them up as fast and hard as you can because they will just die otherwise.
Wow. Well, and being a pharmacist yourself, I mean, you were around where all the, you know, the opioids were being prescribed, all the pill mills to all of the youngsters. I watched the Netflix special, The Pharmacist, with my husband, John, and we were struck by the similarities about how the, you know, the pill mills of old and what we call the pot shops
Oh,
here
absolutely.
in Colorado. You know, you go to a pot doc and, you know, you pay your $500 and they write, you know, their recommendation, and you can legally at 18 go buy, oh, anything you want. You would never do that as a farm, you know, oh, I don't know how much, or I don't know what to take, or here, just, you can take any pills you want. I mean, my husband always laughs at the similarities
Right.
with the pill mills and the pot docs. You know, do you think that that's just basically been replaced with the marijuana?
Absolutely. And, you know, that's why the whole medical side of it is such a farce.
Such a
Because
sham.
if I were writing for a really, you know, for a reputable pain opiate, a reputable narcotic, I'd say, this is what you take. You can take it X number of hours. I'm giving you this amount. And then here's what I expect from you. And I want you to keep track of your pain. And this is all you get. You know, this is what you get. This will be your week's supply. And then you track it. And you make sure that your pharmacist is registered with the, you know, prescription monitoring program, and you keep track of it. And that does not go on with marijuana.
No. Well, and there are FDA approved versions that have the marijuana compounds in them, and you can get legitimate prescriptions. So this has just become, you know, and they even admitted, the marijuana industry, you know, normal, that this was just a red herring to get everybody sympathetic and to get it out there and get it addicted. And it's just so, it is a farce.
I think it was, gosh, right around 1990 or 93 or so, I actually had a video from a normal conference that said, and I quote, "We intend to use the medical excuse as a way to get the camel's nose under the tent."
Wow.
That was their
I bet
presentation.
they'd love to take that back.
And, you know, it just sent chills down my spine because that's exactly what's happened. Exactly what's happened.
Someone just commented that you called it is the media. They're not going to broadcast the truth. And he talked about his governor, Newsom, who just budgeted $100 million to promote pot, you know, the problems that they're having in California.
That's incredible.
Do you think your organization, IASIC, what are your plans? Will you have good communication with the Biden administration? How are you navigating that potential relationship and attempting to influence in any way? Do you have communication with them?
We don't yet. We will definitely. We've got folks that have some connections, and it's a tricky dynamic because some of that administration has been very pro-pot, very supportive of some of the, commercialization. Biden, I've known him for a long time, and actually he, I believe, was one of the main movers for the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and I've testified to his Senate Judiciary Committee back in, God, I don't know when it was, the 90s or 80s. So I think he understands drugs. I think he is questionable about marijuana, but he's got a lot of pressure behind him. And it's not just Democrats. There's a lot of Republicans too that are swept into this. Here in Kansas, most of the people that have been pushing it have been Republicans. Now, fortunately, there are some, more, well-informed Republicans that have been holding it back. But yes, I think it's going to be difficult. I think this is a lot like trying to put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah.
I've kind of felt like if the genie won't go in the bottle, and get a baseball bat and just, bang him until he goes back in. And that's what I kind of hope we would do with IASIC, is get pressure going from real solid scientists to say, this is a mistake. We got to roll this back. Now, I don't know.
Well, yeah, and in Colorado, they, changed the Constitution. So that was a bad way, because now it's, very, very difficult to legislate when it says right in the Constitution that, you can use concentrates. But luckily, it's silent on potency. Your comment about how the more potent it is, the more dangerous, the more addictive, the higher the frequency, the more of the misuse, the addiction, the need to take more drugs, stronger drugs, that's all connected. Let's see, do you find that Narcan is effective against a THC overdose?
I've heard of it used. Technically, it probably wouldn't be because of its actual molecular structure. People aren't generally, well, and I want to be sure I'm right about this, you're not generally going to get a fatal THC overdose. And that's one of the big problems is people say, well, I can use as much as I want to. Well, but boy, you're going to hammer a lot of the other receptors. And that's why you get the psychotic episodes and stuff.
Right.
It's just good that it doesn't suppress respiration and all that like the opiates do. But that doesn't give you just free reign to use as much as you want. Because sooner or later, some place up there is going to have a negative effect from that excessive dose.
Well, and even though the receptors aren't, causing your breathing to stop like they would with the others, and they're not in the brainstem, we still have deaths. People, they're just indirect, from dehydration or CHS or from crashes or from suicide or, all of the things that.
There's been some cardiac deaths, and that's real. I mean, that's absolutely real.
Or in a psychosis, thinking you can fly, or
Well, I've treated some of the psychotic episodes that were literally so crazy. I mean, they were just cooked, just crazy, and they had to be hospitalized on high doses of psychiatric meds, and several of folks went on to just be crazy for a long, long time.
And then they don't realize that they have to be sober for the rest of their lives, that they can't use. And sadly, many of them do go on to use, like Johnny did, not believing the connection. That's
right.
The saddest of all. What do you think about this Colorado bill, the 1317, regulating marijuana concentrates? Do you believe that the system that was approved to track real-time purchases, they call it from seed to sale, but it used to be, you mentioned the prescription monitoring system. Hopefully it's going to be very similar to that. I don't know what you've heard about it. It used to be that they would get a download at the end of the day, and see who bought what. And it was very easy to go over your limits. So hopefully something very similar to the PMP will be put in place to regulate and have people decline if they've already exceeded their limit for the day.
Well, I sure hope so. One of the things that my contacts in Colorado tell me is that really nobody's monitoring the marijuana stuff. You know, now if you had somebody overdose, you know, on an opiate, by God, the medical boards would be crawling all over you.
Yeah.
And what about marijuana? Wait a minute, you know, did they have adverse effects? Is their pain getting better? Or what, you know, that kind of thing. And demonstrated monitoring of how much is prescribed, what was the benefit or problem with that. And patients are coming into pain clinics just, you know, no information. I smoke pot. Wow, that's not helpful, you know. So.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Voth. This has been extremely enlightening. I've enjoyed having our conversation here at the end, and
Absolutely.
I really appreciate your time and talent and for being one of Johnny's ambassadors. Thank you so much.
When I'm open to questions, feel free anytime.
Okay, everyone. Thanks again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.